welcome back to the lecture series. So, we are discussing short story and novel. Uh, as a continuation from our earlier discussion, the novel and the short story can be compared analogically with the film and the photograph, respectively. This is something we were discussing in the context of what Julio Cortázar says regarding these two forms, regarding these two genres. So, since the film is essentially an open order like the novel, whereas a successful photograph presupposes a circumscribed limitation. A photograph always happens within a limited frame, right? But there is still so much that is being communicated through the contents, through what is being perceived within that frame, right? And the photograph is imposed in part by the reduced field that the camera captures, and also by the way in which the photographer uses this limitation. So it's the eye of the photographer that gives us a picture, an effect at once, right? Like a photograph, a short story's effect is also all at once. So, novella as a form has complex semantic historical relations with the novel. According to Graham Good, short fiction is bedeviled for theorists by its adjacency to the longer form. Other genres can be opposed to each other more easily in terms of basic plot form. We are thinking here of genres such as comedy and tragedy that almost share a versus relationship, anti-relationship, vastly different, almost opposed, uh, or genres where the medium of presentation are vastly different, such as the drama as opposed to the novel. However, this kind of clear-cut opposition, according to certain critics, is not possible when comparing or when juxtaposing novel with short story. A novel and short fiction are always in some form of awkward interface, they next to each other, interpenetrating, overlapping, and yet diverging and differing from each other. So we have a lot of overlaps and yet a lot of divergences between these two forms. There has been a number of efforts at disentangling the two genres, the novel and the short story, and this results in a historical and comparative review and treatment of these two genres. Charles May observes that the problem of the short story writer is how to transform a story which is a series of events into something significant, something striking that can transcend the sequence and still tell the story. The two defining attributes of the short story, therefore, are intensity and tension, both of which contribute to the compactness of the form as well as its cultivation of economy, a kind of sparseness in terms of description, and its adaptation of an oblique, elliptical, and concise style. Carver contends that for a short story to exist, there has to be a tension, and a sense that something is imminent, that certain things are in relentless motion, right? Carver draws attention to the fact that this tension in fiction is created not, to quote him, by the way concrete words are linked together to make up the visible action of the story, but also by the things that are left out, that are implied, the landscape just under the smooth but sometimes broken and unsettled surface of things, unquote. So the aesthetics of brevity is something we are trying to understand here. This aesthetics of brevity imposes limitations which directly affect the short story's epistemology as well as style. Brevity prevents the short story from, for example, snowballing too much with descriptions, accumulating too much descriptions, and so it does not allow for extended explanations. The aesthetics of economy accounts for the genre's cryptic and elliptical structure, where a lot is said through actually not saying. Right? The short forms confinement and limitations prevent the writer from delving too much into depth, too much into subplots, or playing too much, journeying too much into the complex psyche or the functioning of the human mind. Compactness and conciseness are responsible for the short story's inclination to fragmentariness, its tendency of describing moments instead of a continuing process, and its preference for the outline of events, the silhouette, rather than a detailed wholeness. The very shortness of the form requires a style that goes against literary conventions based on mimetic artistic principles, because when we are doing mimesis, the word becomes the world and we are getting into the domain of details, right? And so short story has to function, has to move forward through eluding the trivial or the merely decorative, and it is therefore it tries to avoid causal relationships and even sequences, chronology of events. Short fictions make room for uh, commonplace things and events. They do exist in the short story, and yet the ordinary or the uneventful are never allowed to remain as such. Raymond Carver observes that prosaic elements, for example, a chair, a window, curtain, a fork, a stone, a woman's earring, all of these appear in the short story with some immense, even startling power. So the mundane is there to report, to suggest something more than its ordinariness. It is present in the, so everything present in the short story uh, synchronize towards that final meaning, that final impact, which is its aim, right? So it's not scattered. The mundane is not arbitrarily there. It is there with some premeditated purpose. In a short story, just like in a poem, particulars cannot remain as such. They need to be invested with implication and suggestiveness. So the mundane is loaded with, it carries the weight of a suggestion. And details need to be concrete and convey meaning, such that the particular must be given general significance. So we are not talking about a couple, we are not talking about a lone incident. Through it, we are talking about something larger, something that moves out of that one room and two or three people and applies to the general audience, to a larger situation. It becomes something more identifiable with the general conditions of human existence. So the effect of brevity comes through tension, intensity, and relevance. Since the short story cannot resort to elaborate statements, the challenge consists, as Flannery O'Connor would point out, in making, I quote, the concrete work double time. So, making the concrete work double time. In other words, the theme transcends the limitations of the genre and renders it some kind of timeless and spaceless significance. Brevity deforms the real and imposes a greater need for stylization, which in turn requires a greater need for design, contemplation. So, all the characters, all the events are contrived, they are premeditated, and they are conceived into the short story with the vision of the whole. They contribute to the vision of the whole, right? In the dehumanization of art, the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset argues that artistic technique involves distortion as well as defamiliarization of everyday reality. So, Gasset would argue that artistic technique requires moving away from everyday reality to have a more expanded, a better understanding of the same. Otherwise, when we see the reality on on a regular basis, when we inhabit that everyday reality, we don't tend to observe. We are no longer observing them with the eye of a newborn, with the eye of a child, with that wonder. This is taking us again to the topic that we are going to discuss soon, the topic of magical realism and why it is important. Seeing the ordinary with the eye of the magical, with the perception of the magical. It's not necessarily mystic, but the magical, right? And that's possible through distortion, through defamiliarization. With its elliptical, metaphoric, and metonymic discourse, the short story's brevity, conciseness of form generates a heightened sense of concentration, compression, and intensity, which counters the mimetic conceptions of art, a more traditional way of understanding art through mimesis, and it leads to an increased emphasis on aesthetic stylization. So, then we see that the strategies of brevity and concentration are responsible for the highly formalized style of the short story. Since tension and intensity are constitutive traits of the short story, uh, including works that are written in the most realistic vein, do not imitate external reality, but they present a highly patterned, a highly internally organized, well designed representation of a real experience. So, Charles May observes, and I quote, even the most realistic style emphasizes the difference between everyday reality and the reality of fiction itself. So, the reality of mundane life and how it happens in a fiction, which is the only way of penetrating the real on the part of uh, an artwork. So, when real enters the artwork, it becomes a fictional real. In other words, this is something that E.M. Foster very clearly explains in his work. Anton Chekhov states that in the short stories, it is better to say not enough than to say too much. Chekhov's statement is anticipated by several decades of the modern aesthetic agenda or goal. So, Ernest Hemingway's famous iceberg theory, that only the tip of the iceberg shows in any fiction, whereas the untold aspects form the bulk of the iceberg and adds to the story's gravitas, weight. This iceberg theory is inspired by Ezra Pound's imagist principles, right? And the tip of the iceberg is there at once. What happened to the characters before the story began? What will happen to the characters after the story ends? This is where the reader gets involved, the reader gets riveted in a good story. They apply their own imagination, right? And that's the part of the iceberg that remains beyond description, outside of the scope of the story itself. So, after Chekhov and Hemingway, we see the postmodernists such as John Barth observing that unlike the novel, which tends towards inclusion, including more characters, more subplots, the short story inclines towards exclusion. To quote Barth, short story writers as a class from Poe to Paley, referring to Grace Paley, incline to see how much they can leave out. And novelists as a class from Petronius to Thomas Pynchon, how much they can leave in. unquote. The elimination of intermediary links, situations, and ideas, and the tightly wrought unity of form invites the reader to go on a quest for something that is hinted, um, implied, um, obscured, or sometimes hidden behind the texture of words. So, knowing how to read the story to derive the symbolic meaning, the code out of it. So, there is a code underneath the plain words, and the reader has to have the skill to decode it. The story, not as a description, mere description, but as a cipher. Theorists agree that the epistemology of the short story is one of revelation, vision, or insight. The fundamental element of the short story resides not in narrative structure but in the moment of truth. Once again, epiphany or crisis that is conducive to heightened awareness, a momentary realization which marks the passage from ignorance, from unconscious to knowledge, to conscious understanding. As Julio Cortázar would remark, I quote Cortázar here, a story is meaningful when it ruptures its limits with that explosion of spiritual energy, which suddenly illuminates something far beyond that small and sometimes sordid anecdote which is being told. Unquote. This formulation seems to be a recasting of Ezra Pound's famous postulations on the effects of imagist poetics. Ezra Pound's conception of the poem as a delightful psychic experience. To quote Pound, poem tries to record the precise instant when a thing outward and objective transforms itself or darts into a thing inward and subjective. Something that I was trying to drive home uh, through my earlier statements. So, the short story also shares the mysterious property of bringing a fragment to the point of translucency. It renders a moment whose intensity makes it seem outside of the ordinary stream of time and whose significance lies outside the ordinary range of experience. The dramatization, the stylization of this moment of awareness can equally belong to the psychological or to the hidden aspects of everyday life. So, the magic that is ever so present in the ordinary, that becomes the realm of investigation for the magical realist writing. Flannery O'Connor remarks that short story writers make, I quote, alive some experience which we are not accustomed to observe every day or which ordinary man may never experience in his ordinary life, unquote. The short story deals with dreams or fears. It could deal with psychological obsessions, the marvelous, the fantastic, or uh, the absurd. Whether fantastic or realistic, modernist or postmodernist, regardless of, you know, um, whether a work is fantastic or realistic, modernist or postmodernist, focusing on imaginary happenings or realistic everyday accounts, we see that the short story always strives towards something unstated, and yet the unstated, the unsaid has an inkling in the text itself. It is hinted at in the text, and this accounts for its intensity. The reader has to have the eye to read between the lines. In the 19th century short story, drama in the conventional sense, a drama that relies heavily on plot, whereas the modern short story comes to renounce the narrative structure altogether. Even more than the work in the mode of the fantastic, such modernist forms tend to frustrate realistic expectations of cause and effect logic. What led to this? The logic, I mean, the mathematical equation does not always work. in a modern artwork, in a modern uh, creation. This led to that the causality, the logic does not always hold, right? So, influenced by the Chekhovian techniques that combine realistic detail with a romantic poetic lyricism, the modernist short story interiorizes and subjectivizes the notions of plot and design. With the rise of Impressionism, reliance on traditional elements of plot or on temporal sequences of cause and effect leads to the presentation of sensations and inner experience. The modernist narrative, therefore, develops as a mosaic of feelings, moods, and impressions rather than a sequential narrative. We don't have a, 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 a narrative laid out in chronology, rather, we have a bricolage and a distillation of the novel form, one could say. So, what we have made of the ordinary with the self same ordinary happenings, we have been able to evoke the marvel, the magical, the marvelous, the magical, the uh, the out of the world, right? So, privileging objective correlatives for abstract states of mind and feeling, the modernist short story becomes bound by images, symbols, and themes. Intensity derives not from the plot itself, but rather from strategies of points of view or effects of imagery and tone, or even the stylistic economy. Mood and atmosphere supplant events and articulate the structure of the story. I was having in mind the word bricolage, what we could make out of the ordinary events, right? We are reshuffling the uh, ordinary signified relations, and from that point the short story emerges. The short story churns out of this defamiliarized, unfamiliar, besides the truth meaning. Plot, conventional narrative strategies, or marvelous occurrences are therefore replaced by moments of heightened awareness, of sudden illumination. James Joyce's most important contribution to the theory and technique of the modern narrative is his notion of epiphany, which is a variation on the romantic moment of insight into the nature of reality and experience. And so, this is a breakaway, for example, from Wordsworth's passionate desire to see into the life of things. That's it. That is at the heart of the romantic moment of insight, right? See into the life of things. Moving away from that, we are talking about uh, the life of things being represented alternately. So, Robert Langbaum defines the romantic epiphany as a manifestation in and through the visible world of an invisible life. In its modernist instantiation, this moment of insight unveils the hidden structures of the real. At the same time, the spiritual affinities and secret intimations of this moment induce a sense of wonder without necessarily being otherworldly. So, this is where we will start our discussion of magical realism. Magical realism is not really moving away from the worldly, from the mundane. It's not uh, a recourse into or resorting to the mystic. It is seeing the ordinary through the eye of the child. Everything ordinary suddenly becomes marvelous. We are inducing a sense of wonder, a childlike wonder to everyday mundane happenings. The epiphany becomes, therefore, the focus and the structural device of the modern short story form. And this type of writing, which is symptomatic of the modernist era, the modern era, distrusts any structured plot and elements of chronological narrative sequence. So, with this, we come to the end of this module and today's lecture. I'll meet you with a new module and another round of discussions in our following lectures. Thank you.